When historians describe 19th century Berlin, they typically focus on the achievements above ground. The grand boulevards, the imperial architecture, the rapid transformation from Prussian capital to modern metropolis. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in newspapers, the one that even today sits buried in archival footnotes, began below the surface. It started with a simple expansion order. Engineers were instructed to prepare terrain across the growing city for new construction, water infrastructure, and municipal services. The goal was practical: excavate foundations, assess soil stability, and determine whether the ground could support Berlin's ambitious modernization. But the moment workers began penetrating the earth beneath the old city districts, something unexpected happened. They broke through layers that hadn't been exposed in centuries. Beneath the building foundations, deeper than any known construction reached, the crews found channels and chambers that didn't match any documented system. Their design was unusual, their function was perplexing, and the infrastructure didn't resemble anything in the engineering manuals of the era. It didn't even resemble typical European heating systems as commonly understood. This wasn't mentioned in public reports about Berlin's expansion. It didn't make it into the newspapers celebrating Prussia's industrial achievement. But in the internal notes of that period, a quiet phrase appears over and over again. Pre-existing thermal infrastructure, unexpected complexity, origin unknown. The authorized story would later simplify all of this into abandoned medieval cellars, old brewery tunnels, or simply forgotten utility work. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the survey photographs from the time, the ones developed in dim government offices while Berlin celebrated its growth, show something different. They show workers standing beside ceramic-lined channels cut with precision far cleaner than any kiln of the era should allow. Conduits fitted together so tightly that even in the poor lighting of 19th century photography, no gaps are visible. Distribution systems that don't resemble any known heating method but something older, more sophisticated, more deliberate. And the deeper they dug, the more the layers stopped looking like forgotten cellars as we know them, and more like a climate control system that had been buried, hidden, and deliberately forgotten. At first, the excavation teams tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible. Old furnace rooms, abandoned hypercaust remnants, natural underground springs. But as documentation accumulated and more channels were uncovered, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of the underground passages built with thermal tolerances far exceeding anything needed for simple heating? Why were certain ceramic tiles shaped in modular form as if mass-produced rather than handcrafted? Why did some distribution networks extend into areas far beyond the footprint of any documented building? And the question that troubled even the most experienced engineers: why were these systems so extensive? Berlin in the 19th century was industrializing rapidly, yet the thermal infrastructure beneath parts of the old city appeared designed for a heating capacity no contemporary engineer could explain. Survey crews quietly admitted among themselves that the scale and sophistication didn't line up with any known historical period. And although none of them were using terms like lost technology, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built a city-wide heating system before. Not simple fireplaces, not primitive stoves, something else entirely. As the records increased, so did the quiet. Reports became shorter, descriptions became vague, photographs stopped showing the widest views of the discoveries, and then the excavation zones were partially filled again in the late 1800s, covered where needed for new construction, and much of what was exposed was returned to darkness. Only fragments remain, notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of archivists who saw the files before some of them disappeared. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible. Infrastructure too advanced for any known historical period. Engineering too precise for the accepted timeline. Heating methods that look inherited rather than invented. technology that seems to belong to a different era of building entirely. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These mysteries don't fit neatly into official history, and uncovering them requires looking where conventional narratives refuse to go. When the excavation teams moved past the first recognizable layers beneath the expanding districts, the expectations were simple. They believed they would find basement levels, perhaps some medieval cellars, and scattered remnants from earlier construction periods. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within weeks, that assumption collapsed because instead of a neat sequence of building phases, the teams uncovered a stack of thermal infrastructure that didn't behave the way ordinary heating systems are supposed to behave. The first anomaly was integration. Each layer, known basements, unknown sub-basements, and whatever lay beneath, seemed to follow the same heat distribution logic, the same channel patterns, the same engineering principles. Different eras shouldn't do that. Different builders, different purposes, different centuries. They don't build in perfect integration with systems that came generations before. Yet beneath Berlin, they did. Channels from one period connected directly to channels buried meters below them. Heat distribution networks shared the same trajectory even when separated by what appeared to be centuries. Thermal regulators maintained the same orientation even when divided by indefinite time periods. It was as if every group that ever built on this ground was connecting to an original infrastructure, one that no longer existed in any engineering record. As the workers dug deeper, the layers became stranger. Beneath the expected foundations and cellars, they began encountering infrastructure that looked nothing like medieval heating. Much larger channels, much tighter tolerances, patterns that seemed too mathematically precise for anything in Berlin's documented timeline. Some chambers appeared almost over-engineered, vaulted spaces with perfect heat circulation, crafted with precision that didn't match the crude construction methods of any known period. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conservative members of the engineering teams: advanced ceramic systems. Channel walls lined with materials that showed no signs of degradation, ceramic surfaces glazed with techniques that 19th century manufacturers couldn't replicate, lower passages with thermal properties that only modern materials science can explain. Yet there is no historical record of Berlin ever possessing such advanced ceramic production. No documents showing manufacturing capable of creating these heat-resistant materials. Nothing that explains why large sections of the deepest infrastructure appear to have been built with technology far beyond anything medieval Europe is credited with. Survey photographs taken during Berlin's expansion show this clearly. Workers standing beside ceramic-lined channels so perfectly preserved that the materials look almost new. Joints so precisely fitted that even today ceramic engineers study the archival images in disbelief. Thermal systems that resemble modern radiant heating far more than anything 19th century Europe supposedly possessed. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reports written in the years after the expansion barely mention these features. Some drawings omit the deepest thermal systems entirely. Certain infrastructure is summarized with vague terms like earlier construction or utility remnants, even though the photographs show it was far more complex than that. The silence is hard to miss, because if these deeper discoveries truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described in detail? Why weren't the unusual heating methods documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs scattered across municipal archives instead of gathered into a single engineering report? Even some of the channel construction raised a red flag. Surfaces too smooth, measurements too uniform, thermal properties too consistent. Marks that look less like hand construction and more like industrial fabrication. Fabrication that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist when those systems were supposedly built. What the excavation crews uncovered were systems that didn't match medieval construction, didn't match known European engineering, and didn't even match one another in any conventional sense. Instead, they formed a strange technological language, one that seemed to come from a unified source, yet somehow predated everything in the historical record. The first shock came with the distribution chambers themselves. These weren't crude furnace rooms or simple heating pits. They were geometrically perfect spaces, chambers shaped with exact dimensions, vaulted ceilings that maintained their curve flawlessly, and ceramic systems laid out with coherence, almost like the remnants of a master climate control facility that no longer exists in any archive. Some chambers were sealed completely, packed with fill so dense that workers thought they had hit bedrock. But once opened, they revealed interiors that looked untouched since the day they were closed. Smooth walls, fitted ceramic, and heating infrastructure that raised more questions than answers. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today: the thermal regulation mechanisms. Officially, they were later labelled as old furnace equipment or abandoned heating apparatus. But nothing about them fits typical medieval or early modern heating design. These were too sophisticated, too precisely calibrated, and too perfectly integrated with the channel networks, as if they were designed to maintain temperature control across enormous distances. Some regulators were large enough to occupy entire chambers. Others contained internal components that appeared designed for automatic heat adjustment. Workers from the 1800s described them in private letters as engineered thermostats, not simple dampers but control mechanisms with a climate regulation function, though no one could determine what technology powered them. Another anomaly appeared in the heat source locations themselves. These were not merely chambers with fireplaces or coal storage. Many were positioned at depths that made no practical sense for fuel delivery, integrated into the infrastructure in ways that suggested the heat came from below, not from combustion chambers filled from above. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The buildings above ground may not simply rest on foundations with basement heating. They may sit on something much larger, a geothermal or chemical heat generation system whose technology was never recorded, never taught, and never explained in the official history of Berlin. The deeper the workers dug, the stranger the findings became. Channel segments appeared with perfectly uniform ceramic linings. Some surfaces were glazed smooth, almost frictionless. Others showed precision-formed joints so clean that modern heating engineers still debate about what manufacturing process could have produced them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the material composition of certain components. Some pieces were made of ceramic compounds that chemists of the 1800s couldn't identify. Others showed crystalline structures in the glazing that only form under kiln conditions far beyond any documented furnace of the era. The official explanation offered later: imported materials, unusual clay deposits. But that does not explain why these materials appear in engineered systems, not raw form, shaped, processed, manufactured into precise heating infrastructure. That kind of ceramic engineering requires temperatures and techniques far beyond 19th century capability, far beyond anything recorded in European industrial history. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began happening. Chambers were filled again, channels were blocked, deep sections of the thermal system were cut off from further investigation. Some of this was officially labelled as safety concerns necessary to support new construction above. But the decisions about which chambers to fill first and which areas to bury permanently raised quiet questions among observers, because the spaces that were closed immediately were always the ones that contained the most anomalous infrastructure. The precision regulators, the unknown ceramic compounds, the integrated distribution systems, the engineered chambers that seemed to extend far beyond the excavation zone. These connecting networks were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random tunnels, they were part of an organized pattern, a grid of thermal channels that looked less like heating and more like citywide climate control. Aligned, standardized, planned, as if they once served every major district of Berlin through an underground system we no longer recognize. And yet, almost as soon as they were uncovered, many were sealed again. Their entrances blocked, their purpose unexplored, their existence quietly removed from subsequent city plans. When you study the final phases of Berlin's 19th century expansion, something becomes impossible to ignore. The investigation didn't end. It was stopped. Not completed, not concluded, stopped. The deeper the excavation teams went, the more the tone of their notes changed. Early entries were confident, almost routine. But by the end, the language becomes cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be documented. And this is where the final mystery begins, because the last chambers they opened beneath Berlin weren't ordinary. They weren't medieval, they weren't early modern, they weren't even identifiable as any known type of heating system. They were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described infrastructure that suddenly shifted from the familiar to the unexplainable. Ceramic systems with thermal properties so advanced you couldn't replicate them with period technology. Distribution networks designed with precision that 19th century Europe was never supposed to possess. Chambers built to regulate climate across areas far larger than anything documented in the city above, and channels that extended beyond the excavation zone, disappearing into darkness beneath modern Berlin. But here's the part that always gets buried. The most advanced systems were the ones that were reburied the fastest. Workers described filling entire thermal chambers back in, sealing access points, packing earth into spaces that had just been uncovered. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official explanation: structural concerns, construction deadlines, municipal priorities. But if it was only about practical matters, why were the most sophisticated, most perfectly preserved heating systems the ones sealed first? And why were the obviously damaged medieval sections left exposed for documentation? It doesn't make sense unless those deeper discoveries posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the infrastructure beneath Berlin truly showed climate control technology far beyond 19th century capability, and if some of those systems didn't match any known civilization at all, then the entire accepted narrative of European technological development begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if a modern city was built on top of something far older, something sophisticated, something engineered for citywide climate control, something we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the heating systems weren't medieval innovations, but medieval attempts to repurpose or hide technology they couldn't explain. And maybe that is why the discoveries during Berlin's expansion were quietly reburied. Not to protect the sites, but to protect the narrative. The surviving photographs tell their own story. Workers standing next to ceramic systems that look almost industrial, distribution networks that resemble modern radiant heating, infrastructure too integrated for its supposed age. These aren't the kinds of discoveries historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to talk about at all. And that brings us to the final question, a question no archive, no textbook, no official publication has ever answered fully. Why was the most advanced evidence, the most sophisticated infrastructure, the most anomalous thermal systems sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The precision ceramic work was buried. The thermal regulators were buried. The distribution networks were buried. The climate control chambers were buried. The unknown materials were buried. And even parts of the photographic record vanished, almost as if the expansion had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than medieval Berlin, older than recorded construction methods, older than the narrative we were given. And for one brief moment in the 1800s, the earth opened just enough to show it. But instead of studying it, they closed it again, sealed it, filled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Berlin stands on top of a heating system built by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered during the expansion. It's what else lies beneath the cities of the world. What other capitals? What other infrastructure? What other thermal systems were quietly reburied long before anyone thought to question the official story? Tartaria's underground heating networks weren't just forgotten infrastructure from an earlier period. They were a brief accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never meant to see. And now that glimpse is your clue, your map, your invitation to question everything we think we know about how our world was really heated. Because if this is what survived under one city, imagine what still radiates warmth in the darkness beneath the rest. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.